back to another Karting 101 video here on the Course of Sport channel. This is my series where I'm going into details on all the things you need to know about go-karting, whether it's driving or chassis tuning or racecraft or whatever it is. And today we're coming up on a hotly requested topic, which is basic chassis tuning. And I've put together this guide, and bear with me, inevitably I'm going to dive into this and get too technical, but my main goal here is to try to go over the basics of every adjustment on the go-kart and kind of explain what they do, why you would use them, and then we'll go over some things more in depth. But what I really want to do is try to keep it a little bit more basic. I know I'm going to ramble, I know I'm going to make this a super long video talking way too much about every single adjustment, but bear with me. I think by the end of this we're going to come out of this with a much better understanding of what makes a go-kart work, how you tune a go-kart, how to make a go-kart fast, and what we're physically actually doing when we're making these adjustments to make the go-kart handle differently. So let's just dive into it right away. So the first topic I want to go over is how a go-kart works, because I think a lot of confusion comes from people not really understanding what makes a go-kart handle well as opposed to a car or a different vehicle. A go-kart is quite a bit different than any other vehicle, so it kind of takes a specific philosophy and understanding to really understand how you're going to tune the go-kart. So the first thing that we need to remember in a go-kart is that there is no differential. So the rear axle is solid and it connects both rear wheels. So in a car, for example, you have a differential, which allows both of those rear wheels to turn at a different rate. So when you go around a corner, the outside wheel, which is on a wider arc than the inside rear wheel, is allowed to turn faster so that you don't scrub speed, the tires don't scrub as you go through the corner. We don't have that in a go-kart. Both wheels are always turning at the same rate. So when you go into a corner, one tire is always going to be scrubbing against the track surface, unless we lift that tire off the ground, which is kind of the whole goal of tuning a go-kart and getting it to work right, is tuning the amount of inside rear wheel lift we get when we go into a corner. So you can see it here in this picture that I've got the 388 kart right here has got about 2 inches of rear wheel lift here going into the corner. And that's accomplished by changing the chassis flex, so the physical frame of the go-kart, how it's flexing under load to get that inside rear wheel off the ground and help the kart rotate. And pretty much every adjustment we're making is going to be changing how fast that inside rear wheel unloads, how much it unloads, how quickly it sets down again when you unwind the steering wheel, and that's going to be like the whole goal of everything we do for the most part. So the way I look at this is I always try to think about every adjustment in terms of how it's affecting the inside rear wheel lift. It can be very confusing for people to understand the difference between inside rear wheel lift, how we're controlling that, and grip. Kind of the layman's version of terminology would be that, a kart that is sliding the rear of the kart, most people would say I need more rear grip. In reality, you don't really need more rear grip technically. The grip is determined by the tires. The tires have a set amount of traction available based on the rubber. And that's what's physically keeping you on the track. So when we're tuning the kart, we're not changing that tire. We're changing the frame and how it uses the tires. So sometimes it can get kind of confusing when people say, oh, I need more grip on this end of the kart. Well, really you don't need more grip. You need to change how the frame is flexing to use that grip more effectively. This gets really confusing specifically in terms of, like, sometimes a kart will have either understeer or oversteer, and the solution to both of those problems can be the same adjustment. So sometimes you put more front width in a kart, or you put less rear width in a kart to control how the go-kart is flexing. And sometimes the same adjustment can have two completely opposite effects on the kart depending on where you are, like where the kart is set up, the chassis, how it's working in that specific situation. And that's where I think people get lost, is they start to think about grip rather than lift. So we always want to be thinking about how much inside rear wheel lift we have, how fast it's happening, how high it's getting off the ground, and kind of tune from that theory rather than tuning for grip. So like I said, the flex of the chassis is how we control that inside rear wheel lift. And when we're making adjustments like adding caster, widening the front of the cart, narrowing the rear of the cart, changing axles, all that stuff is controlling the rate and amount of flex that you're getting through the frame of the cart. And all of that's controlling how you get that inside rear wheel to lift, whether you want more or less. And then another huge factor in karting that's a little bit different than like a car would be that the driver makes up like 50% of the ballast of the whole vehicle. And the driver is not a piece of steel. The driver is a floppy sack of meat in the seat. So your posture in the cart, the way you drive the cart, it all affects the attitude of the cart to a huge degree. So, even if you have really good posture in the cart and you're staying really firm and stable in the cart, the way you drive still has a huge effect on the handling of the go-kart as well. So basically the goal of everything here is to achieve balance in the cart. We want the cart to not really have too much oversteer or not have too much understeer. A little bit is okay here or there. Some drivers prefer a cart that's a little bit freer. Some drivers prefer a cart that's a little bit more pushy. But for the most part, we're looking for a pretty balanced cart. And when we have a balanced cart, what that means is when you turn the wheel, it reacts at the rate you want it to react. And when you turn, and it doesn't slide the rear, it doesn't push the front tires. It feels like you can drive it pretty easily to some extent. And when you're doing that, what you're really doing is you're utilizing the tires to the maximum grip potential. You're not going over the grip limit of the tire, you're not driving under the grip limit of the tire. Anytime that you go over the limit of a tire, you're going to result in some sort of handling problem. Or if you drive too far under the limit of the tire, you also will have handling problems. So we want a cart that's balanced and drivable at the limit, so that we're always using the tires to their max potential. And then along with this, there's years and years of paddock gossip and knowledge that floats around out here. And people will say, they have these sayings like loose is fast, for example, which is a myth. Loose can be fast sometimes, but really any time that you're sliding the tires, you're not using them to their full potential. You're going over their limit. So you're either overheating them or you're doing something that's making the tire slip. We don't really want the tire to slip if we can avoid it. Another myth would be that, if the cart feels like it's handling really well, this setup is good. A lot of times what you'll see when you start to travel to bigger races is where there gets to be more grip on the track. The cart will feel really good because there's a bunch of rubber on the track. You can drive it wherever you want. But a lot of times, people will be like, I don't get it, the cart feels great, but I'm just slow. And a lot of that comes down to the setup and how the cart is not rotating all the way through the corner. The rear tires are setting down too early. That inside rear wheel is setting down too early in the corner. It's scrubbing speed on the track surface, like we talked about, where the two tires are trying to spin at different rates. The inside rear wheel is trying to spin at a different rate, and it's scrubbing, and the cart feels slow off the corner, even though the balance seems pretty good. Another one that I hear a lot is a given setup that you come up with will always work on the same track, and that's just not true. Even though we're dealing with paved tracks, sprint tracks, when we talk about sprint karting, the track is still going to go through huge evolutions throughout the day, throughout the year. If you're racing a club series all year round, whatever setup you're running at the beginning of the year, when the track has no rubber on it, it's dirty, and the weather is, whatever, is not necessarily going to be the same setup you want to be running in the heat of the summer when there's more rubber down and you've been racing on the track for half a year. So the setup you come up with is good to have a baseline, but you're always going to want to be tweaking on that setup probably as the day goes on and as the year goes on, and whatever other variables are up in the air that you're going to be working with. Another common one is a certain kart brand is better than another kart brand. The reality is that most karts from the major manufacturers, and these days there's a few manufacturers that make most of these sub-brands as well. Most of these karts are going to be pretty capable of being competitive at the front of any field, and it kind of comes down to the driver. If you take a really high caliber national level driver and you put them in any go-kart brand, they're going to be competitive. So it's not so much that each individual brand is good. Some karts have nicer components, some karts, they've got better fit and finish, whatever it is. That stuff all comes into play. But in reality, most of the brands are all pretty similar in how they're going to perform, as long as you know how to tune it and you know how to drive it. Another one along with the setup thing is that a lot of people think that, I have this setup on my kart, it works really well. Another driver might come along, be a little bit lost, and say, I need some help, can you help me? They'll say, yeah, take my setup off this kart, put it on your kart, and the second driver is like, I hate this, it doesn't handle at all, it doesn't feel good, it's slow. And that kind of goes along with the same thing as the track variables is driver variables. Everybody has a little bit different driving style, everybody has a little bit different posture, and everybody has kind of a different way they drive. Even if they're, all very good drivers and they're kind of adhering to the same technique, every driver is a little bit different. So what works for one driver might not necessarily work for another driver. If you have two really good drivers, the same setup will get close probably for both of those drivers, but they might need some tweaking. I know when I used to race for Merlin back in the day, what would work for my setup would be similar to the other fast guys on the team, but I might require a little bit more caster in the kart, a little bit stiffer of an axle, just because that was the way I drove. I have a tendency to drive a little bit smoother, and some of my teammates would drive a little bit more aggressively, so they were able to make the kart work more without the caster, where I needed the caster to get the kart to work more. So setup A will not always work for driver B, but it should get you close if both of you are good drivers. But yeah, everybody's a little bit different, so you're going to have to find a baseline setup and kind of tune to your own technique a little bit as well. And then some general tuning tips that I like to keep in the back of my mind. Simple adjustments can accomplish a lot. So playing with track widths, front end geometry, and like the front torsion bar, when I'm racing, and I usually race on a OTK kart, Tony kart, Cosmic kart, those are the adjustments that I mess with 90% of the time. Just simple things like that. Track widths and caster, you can do a ton with that. So if you really understand how to use those adjustments and when to start bringing them into play during the day, you can accomplish a lot. And what people have a tendency of doing is they want to throw a bunch of adjustments at it. We have to remember that the driver is a huge factor in this. So if you're not driving at the limit, if you're not at the full potential of what the car is capable of, you're leaving a lot on the table there. And big swings on the chassis are not going to get you there. Driving is what you need to fix. So a lot of people have a tendency to take really big swings. Every session they want to throw a different axle in. Every session they want to move the seat. Every session they want to move weight. And all you're doing is you're just overshooting the goal of where you're trying to get to. You're here, the goal is here, and when you change an axle, you're getting over here. You're just creating a different set of handling issues. So don't be afraid to make small adjustments throughout the day. Find a good baseline setup that works for you, and just try to tweak it a little bit throughout the day. And along with that is people have a tendency to fall behind the track. So like I was saying before, the track has a tendency to evolve during the day. The grip levels change. Sometimes there gets to be more grip. Weather can change how the track handles. So you always kind of want to try to be staying ahead of the track, we say. So when you come off the track, if you say, oh, the car has a little bit of understeer, but it was pretty good, next session, assuming the track is going to evolve, you got to think in the back of your mind, if it was pretty good but it had a little bit of understeer that time, we want to make 2 steps rather than 1 step. So instead of just tweaking to what we felt in that last session, we want to tweak for what we're anticipating the track is going to do in the next session. So instead of widening it 5 millimeters in the front to fix what I was feeling in the first session, I'll maybe widen it 10 millimeters in the front to fix where I think it's going to be in the next session. It can be really easy, especially at bigger races, to fall behind the track. Like you just feel like you never can catch up. The kart's never feeling good, and it's just a matter of building that experience and trying to stay ahead of the track evolution a little bit. Another good practice to do is to keep track of all your adjustments on some sort of setup sheet. This is invaluable to be doing, especially when you're starting out tuning the kart, when you're not super experienced at it. Like for me, I've been racing long enough that when I go to a track, it's just in my head. I'm like, oh yeah, we run less caster here. Oh yeah, we run, this axle more often here. The track builds grip like this, so I know by the end of the day we should be doing this on the setup. But if you don't have that knowledge base, there's no better way to build that than to write notes. So I have some setup sheets that I use, but a simple Excel document or just a sheet of loose leaf, just write down everything you did each session and just try to keep track of all those adjustments and make notes on why you did something, how it made the kart feel. All that stuff is going to build a big reference manual for you after years of racing. When you go to this track, you can pull out your binder of notes and you can just go, yes, this is the gear we ran, this is the setup we were using. I have a huge binder of notes like that that's buried somewhere in a box, but yeah, it's super important to keep track of all that stuff when you're starting out. Practice days. When you go to do a practice day, you want to obviously focus on driving and nailing your laps and all that stuff, but it's also good to play with the setup a little bit. So if you feel like the setup is good, it can be really helpful to purposely, make a big swing, widen the rear really wide or widen the front really wide, and go out and do some laps and just see how it feels. The driver is a very important part of this. The feedback that they're providing is super important. So if the driver can't provide feedback on what each adjustment is doing or how the track is feeling or how the kart feels over the course of the run, it's going to be really difficult to tune the kart. So on a practice day, it's good to go out and try a bunch of stuff, get a feel for what every adjustment kind of feels like, and build up that knowledge base within yourself so that when you go to the racetrack for a race, you can say, oh, well, I know on practice day we did this and it made the kart feel like this, and I think that's what we need at this point. A lot of these guys who are really good, a lot of top-level national drivers, it's kind of second nature to them. They come in and they go, yeah, I think we need more caster. It isn't necessarily that they're feeling a handling deficiency. It's just that they know from experience as they go through the day, they're like, yeah, I can kind of see where this is going, and I think we're going to need more caster. It'll make the kart feel like I want it to feel. So building up that feedback is really important, and learning what all these adjustments feel like is also super important. Speaking of adjustments, let's dive into these adjustments. So I'm going to kind of highlight what each of these adjustments does and kind of when I use it. And keep in mind, this is kind of based on some general rules for tuning. Every go-kart kind of tunes a little differently. Every brand has a little bit different method on how they make the kart work. So this is some general stuff. Keep in mind that we're trying to figure out and instruct on what the kart is physically doing, what you're changing to make the handling different. And so these are more general rules. But the first one we're going to start out with, we're going to start from the top, or from the front of the kart to the back of the kart, is front track width. This is a super easy adjustment to make. It's one of my go-tos for small tweaks. It's nice to use this to fine-tune the front end a little bit. So basically, as you go wider on the front end, you're creating more weight jacking because you're amplifying the leverage you have in the front end and the geometry that's at play, the caster and the camber, to jack weight through the frame of the go-kart, twist that frame, and lift the inside rear wheel off the ground. So as you go wider, you're creating more of that weight jacking. It's going to make the steering heavier, and it's going to give you more inside rear wheel lift. Generally what we use this for is to get the kart to turn in a little bit better. We want the kart to react a little bit faster when we turn the wheel. So we're kind of amplifying that front end by widening the front. If you go narrower, you're doing less work with the front end, less weight jacking, and it can create some lighter steering, and it's going to not lift the inside rear wheel as much. So like I said, it's kind of a finer adjustment. Most karts are starting with a set front end width that they're prescribing in their setup manuals for whatever brand, and they kind of just vary a little bit to tune the balance of the go-kart. It's not a huge change, it's not a huge swing, but it's a really easy swing. So if you feel like you might have a handling issue, this is a quick and easy one to start off with. It's, wheels off, spacer out, spacer in, wheels back on, and go out and see if it does anything, see if it fixes what you were looking for. The next one we're moving down on the kart would be the front torsion bar. So like I said, all karts kind of work a little differently, different brands work a little differently. Not every kart uses a front torsion bar, and not every kart uses it the same way. So some karts like to flex the front end a little bit more, some like a stiffer front end, and they do all their work in the rear of the kart. But in general, what we're talking about with a front torsion bar is going stiffer is going to give you faster weight jacking. It's going to give you faster inside rear wheel lift, but it's also going to set the inside rear wheel lift sooner in the corner. And a softer bar is going to jack weight more slowly, but it's going to let the rear wheel set down more slowly. So basically what you're doing, it's a torsion bar. So what it's doing is it's creating stiffness or removing stiffness from the front of the kart. So it's changing the roll of the kart a little bit as well. So when you stiffen up that front end, you're again amplifying the effect of the caster and the camber of the kart. So you're increasing how much weight jacking you're putting through the frame, but you also have to keep in mind that you're stiffening the whole go-kart, which is going to make it want to resist lift in the rear, even though you're putting the bar in the front. It's stiffening the relationship between the two side rails. So that's why it sets the rear down quicker too. We always try to think of the go-kart as a spring. The frame is a spring, and as we're changing this stuff, it can be helpful to visualize it that way, where it's a spring. So if you're putting a stiffer bar on the front, you're stiffening that spring, so when that spring is pulled, the kart lifts, and when you let go of that spring, it snaps, it sets down quicker when it's stiffer. So this is, depending on what kart you're running, this is kind of a medium-sized adjustment to change the overall stiffness of the kart. Like on a Tony kart, for example, which is what I have most experience with, you put the front bar in, it's always in, you run it in all the time for the most part. Stiffer is going to make the kart turn in a little bit sharper. Softer is going to make it, keep that inside rear wheel off the ground a little bit longer, but it's not going to turn in quite as sharp. It's going to be a little bit lazier on turn in. So yeah, sometimes I use this if I want to get a little bit more turn in. Usually what I'm doing is I'm turning the bar to make it a little bit stiffer. And manufacturers have different ways of doing this. Like in this picture here, you can see this. They have these slots cut out. So the way the bar is in the kart right now in this GP kart, it's got two slots, so it's softer this way. And then if you twist the bar, it's only got one slot showing, so it's stiffer that way. So that's how they adjust this. Some manufacturers, like Tony Kart, have a blade bar where it's flat, and as you twist it, it gets more stiff as you get vertical with the bar. And then other manufacturers have a variety of bars. Maybe they use a nylon bar if they want something really soft. Maybe they use a solid bar if they want something really stiff. So it kind of all depends on the kart. But in general, stiffer is going to give you a little bit more turn in and a little bit more traction off the corner. The next thing on the kart that I play with quite a bit actually is caster and camber. So if you're unaware, caster is the kingpin bolts, as you can see them in the yoke right here on the spindle. The kingpin bolts, caster, you're adjusting the kingpin bolt tilting forward or backward. Now what that's doing is adjusting how quickly you're jacking the weight through the kart, because it's changing how the wheel presses down into the track when you turn the wheel. Because the wheel physically doesn't just turn left and right, it also presses down, it goes down into the track to jack weight and get that inside rear wheel off the ground. So if you increase caster, which would be tilting the kingpin back, the top of the kingpin back, you're increasing caster. That's going to give you more weight jacking, faster inside rear wheel lift. And if you tilt the kingpin forward, you are taking caster out of the kart, you're going negative caster. Although all karts have some caster built into the frame to work properly, but if you're removing caster from your baseline, you're slowing down the inside rear wheel lift, you're taking less weight jacking through the frame, and you're reducing a little bit of the scrub in the front end of the cart. So this is kind of like a medium adjustment that I like to use quite a bit. And I've got it written in the notes here that a smaller driver, someone who doesn't have as much weight up top in the seat, might need a little bit more caster because they don't have the body weight to jack the weight in the seat. And sometimes taller drivers run less caster because they can use their body a little bit more in the seat to create leverage and get the cart to tip up on the outside. The other part of this is camber. So most go-karts are using an eccentric pill on top there. So it's this round pill on top that the kingpin sits in, and it's offset, it's eccentric, so when you turn it, it tilts the kingpin in a direction. This means that the caster and the camber are not independent, so whenever you adjust caster, you're actually adjusting camber as well. Some carts have a sniper pill where you can loosen them independently and you can move the kingpin back and forth or forward and back. But most carts are using an eccentric pill like this setup on this comp cart here in the picture. And so camber, what we're kind of doing is we're, instead of tilting the kingpins back and forward, we're tilting the kingpins inward or outward. Negative camber is in, positive camber is out. Negative camber, what it's doing is it's going to create less contact patch with the tire, so the tire, as much of the surface of the tire is not sitting on the track. Tires are like this. I can't show it with my hands. Tires are like this. They go like this. You're riding more on the inside shoulder of the tire. This can be good for qualifying because it heats up the front tires quicker because you have less contact patch. So you're running on that shoulder of the tire, really heating up that shoulder, so it can make the cart come in a little bit quicker in qualifying. Positive camber flattens the tire out a little bit, and that's going to make it maybe feel a little bit heavier, but it's going to give you more grip because you're getting more contact patch onto the track. I kind of use this as a finer adjustment for controlling either tire wear or tire temp, or slightly reducing or increasing the amount of caster, because like I said, anytime you adjust camber, you're also adjusting caster. So if you've got the pill straight forward to go full caster in, or sorry, it depends on the cart. If you got the caster pill pointed so that you have full caster in, some carts it's forward, some carts it's backwards, the way the pill is. It's confusing, I know. These are general rules, but if you've got the caster in and you turn the pill a little bit to get more camber, you're actually removing a little bit of caster that way as well. But I kind of use this for qualifying or for controlling the wear I want on the tire. More of a fine-tuning adjustment, when I don't want full caster one direction also. The next one is the front ride height, which you can see here is in this spindle. There's washers in there, and you can move them up or down. Put more washers on the bottom or the top to raise the spindle in the chassis. That changes the ride height. In general, if you're raising the front ride height, you're getting more turn in because your spindles are being pushed into the track harder when you turn the wheel. If you lower the front ride height, you're kind of lightening the steering up. You're getting a little bit less turn in because you're raising those spindles up and they're not excuse me, and they're not being pushed in the track as hard. So this is kind of a medium adjustment, and it kind of changes how much work the front is doing, how much the tires are doing. And this can be helpful on tracks like where there's kind of an unusual grip level, where there's no grip at all or there's a lot of grip. We use this at Superdance a little bit in the parking lot track, where it's literally a parking lot, so there's no grip on the track at all. So we can kind of use that to control how the cart is, forcing the front tires into the track. I don't play with this too much. I usually leave it kind of in the middle, but it can be very helpful in some specific conditions. Again, just another tool to work the front tires a little bit differently. Moving backwards now to the seat. This one's a little bit more complicated. So, seating position, first of all, is a huge component of getting your cart to handle. Most cart brands are going to have some kind of seating chart for you to set your seat up based on your height and your weight. And the idea there is that you're trying to get the seat set in a position where the driver is both comfortable, but also the weight distribution is correct. Having your seat in the incorrect place will throw the weight distribution completely off, and it's going to completely ruin the way the cart handles. It's not going to want to respond to chassis adjustments. So getting the seat in the right spot is a super important part of initially setting the kart up. With that then, moving the seat as an adjustment has a pretty big impact. So if you're moving the seat, you want to move it in small increments. Moving it to the front of the kart can change the weight distribution to the kart on the front, make it more on the nose, make it want to turn a little bit more. Moving it back can make it want to be a little bit lighter in the front, but it might jack weight more to the outside tire. In general, the seat is going to be mounted a certain height as well. Moving the seat up is going to raise your center of gravity. So, you take a short driver like me and you raise the seat up. Effectively, you're making me a tall driver. Now I'm able to flex the kart a little bit more with my body. You take a very tall driver who's having a problem flexing the kart too much. You drop that seat down. All of a sudden, their center of gravity is lower, and they're not going to overwork the kart. With that, there's also softer or stiffer seats, and that's going to change how the kart is going to flex in the center and how the weight is going to be transported to the rear of the kart. So when you're jacking weight through a softer seat or a stiffer seat, it's going to change how it works that outside tire. It's kind of like a torsion bar in the middle of the kart in that way. But most manufacturers are going to have a seat, a position, all that stuff. So if you can find a guide on your specific brand, they're usually, you can Google this and most brands have a guide. That's where I would start. Seat adjustments are kind of like a pretty big swing because you're fundamentally changing the balance and the weight distribution of the kart. So if you're making a seating adjustment, you're probably pretty far out of the ballpark and you need a big swing. So for me, it's usually a last resort. If my other adjustments are not working, I'll go to a seating change. I feel like if I'm tuning the whole go-kart and nothing's working, the seat's probably not in the right spot for the conditions. Along with that, we've got seat struts or seat stays, which are the chrome stays here. Similar to kind of how the seat works, this changes how the weight is transferred to the chassis and the outside tires. So obviously if you stiffen up the relationship between the seat and the chassis, that's going to change how that weight is distributed to the chassis itself. Fewer seat struts will make it softer. So what that's going to do is, it's going to help the kart flex a little bit more because it's not as stiff from the seat to the frame, but it's also not going to be able to transfer as much load to the outside tire. And conversely, if you add more seat struts, it's going to make the kart stiffer, but it's also going to allow you to transfer more weight to the outside tire. So it's kind of a trade-off. Most of the time in medium to high horsepower applications, you're running one per side at least. Some people want to run two. The good thing about two is if one breaks, you have an extra. But it's a pretty small adjustment. It doesn't make a huge difference in what I've seen. I like to run two usually just because I like to get as much weight transfer as I possibly can because I'm not tall and I don't weigh a lot. Sometimes taller drivers even will run no seat struts because they're overworking the kart constantly with their tall upper body. Their center of gravity is too tall, so they overload the outside tire. But like I said, that can make the kart flex a little bit more too, so it's kind of a trade-off. You kind of got to test it a little bit and see what's going to work for you. Next up, we've got rear track width. This is another easy adjustment, similar to the front track width. So essentially what you're doing is you're moving the rear wheels in or out, and if you move them in, narrow the rear track width, what you're kind of doing is what I think of is you're raising the relative center of gravity. So you're not technically raising the driver up, but what you're doing is you're bringing the rear wheels in. So relative to the width of the kart, the center of gravity is changing. And if you narrow it, this is going to give you more aggressive weight transfer because your driver is going to be better able to tip the kart. The kart's going to have a tendency to want to tip up on the side a little bit more. It's going to give you a little bit more side bite in the rear. And if you widen the rear track, what you're doing is you're lowering that center of gravity, less aggressive on the weight transfer. The kart's not going to want to tip up as much. A knock-on effect of both of these is you're tuning also how much axle is exposed, which is kind of changing the stiffness of the axle. It's not a huge difference though, so I don't really worry about that. I more just worry about how you're raising or lowering the effective center of gravity. So this is kind of another fine adjustment like the front track widths. I just adjusted in small increments to kind of change the balance and kind of change how fast the kart is lifting that inside rear wheel. Narrower obviously is going to help it jack weight more aggressively. So sometimes if I'm feeling like the kart is pretty good, but maybe it's just a little bit slidey in the rear, moving the rears in 5 mil fixes that a lot of the time. So it's a pretty helpful adjustment. It's pretty easy to make too. The key here is not making huge swings on this. It's a fine adjustment. I always adjust in like 5mm increments. So like also if the kart feels like it's hopping, or it's just jacking weight way too aggressively when you turn the wheel, widening the rear out a little bit can settle it down just enough to get it to start working again. So I like track width. I play with it quite a bit. Most manufacturers, you're going to play in a window somewhere near the max legal track width. Most series have a max legal track width of 1400 millimeters or 55 1/8 inches. But you're kind of going to play in a range, probably, somewhere below that. But yeah, I like this adjustment a lot. It's pretty quick, pretty easy, and it can kind of tell you right away whether or not your assumptions on what the kart is doing are wrong or right. Along with that, we have rear hubs, where the wheel physically attaches to the axle. Rear hubs kind of control how much of the axle is exposed, and it can change how the axle flexes on the ends of the axle. So like a shorter rear hub is going to let the end of the axle flex more, and a lot of times what that does is it keeps the outside tire a little bit flatter on the track surface. Most karts are running a medium hub like 99% of the time, and that's what I do too. I actually don't really like hub adjustments on the rear because I never really feel like they make the kart handle the way I want it to. So I run the medium hub on the rear pretty much all the time. I know some people who really swear by it. They run longer or shorter hubs depending on what they're feeling. But for me, the medium hub kind of is my go-to for like every condition. But yeah, it can be useful. It's a good tool to have in your toolbox. One of my other favorite adjustments is rear ride height. So not all karts actually have the ability to adjust the rear ride height. You can see here the way the cassettes sit in here, the bearings. They're bolted in here. This kart, I think this is a Formula K. It looks like it might have a slotted thing here, a slotted hole where this bolts in, so it can have a higher or lower rear ride height. So again, talking about weight jacking, a higher rear ride height is going to give you more and faster weight jacking because you're essentially raising the driver up. You're raising the kart off the ground, you're getting the driver up, it's changing your center of gravity, it's moving it up. And a lower rear ride height is going to give you less weight jacking. The kart's going to be flatter, and in some cases that can actually give you better traction off the corner. For me personally, I prefer to run, I play with ride height quite a bit, and I like to run higher rear ride height because again, I'm a shorter driver, I don't weigh a lot, so getting me up and getting the kart to jack weight is a little bit more difficult. So for me, this kind of changes the attitude of the kart, and I really like how it feels. It feels like the kart gets a lot more side bite when you raise the rear ride height, so it's another adjustment that I like to play with a lot. It's a pretty big adjustment. Like if the kart feels like it's balanced pretty well, but it's just not quite fast enough, doesn't quite have enough side bite, this will completely change the way the kart feels. It'll keep the balance, but it'll give you the side bite. So it's one of my go-to changes when I feel like the kart is not digging that outside tire in hard enough to lift the inside rear wheel. And now we're on to axles, which not even going to go into this very deep because axles are like It's like voodoo for the most part. So, um, I mean, the internet constantly has debates on what axles actually do, if they actually do anything, or if it's just a huge conspiracy by big go-kart manufacturer to get us to buy more axles. Personally, I think they do something. I think there are different axles that actually change the way the kart handles. Every brand, though, has a different scale of where their axles are, so we don't know, you know, if kart A's medium axle is the same as kart B's medium axle. And every kart kind of uses the axles a little differently. So some karts, if they feel like they need to get the rear to free up, like it's not releasing off the corner, they'll go to a hard axle. Where some other karts will go to a soft axle. Completely 180 from each other. Don't know why. Nobody knows. It's a mystery. My recommendation on axles would be to get the medium axle that comes with your go-kart and kind of just leave it in for most of the time. 95% of the time, the way go-karts are built these days, the medium axle from most major brands is going to work. They keep building go-karts with wider and wider tuning windows. They want it to be user-friendly, so you don't need to have me make you an hour-long video to explain to you how it all works. They want it to be easy to tune. And easy to tune would mean, you know, we don't have to swap axles all the time. So most go-karts these days pretty much run the medium axle most of the time. Unless you're getting to extreme grip conditions where the track is building a bunch of rubber and getting really grippy, or you're running in the rain where there's no grip, you're probably going to run the medium axle most of the time on most karts. An axle change is kind of a big, it's a very big change. What it's kind of doing is resetting the level of where the kart's at. So you got the kart on the medium axle, for example, at like a national race where there's a bunch of rubber, the track's evolving a lot. And you're tuning and tuning and tuning, and you kind of plateau on your tuning. The kart's not really getting any better. What you're going to want to do then is you're going to have to change axle. You're going to have to go to the next axle on your axle chart, which most manufacturers have some kind of axle chart to tell you what's hard, what's soft, and where they lay in the range and what they're recommended for. So if you're at this national race and you got to change an axle, what you're doing is you're changing the baseline of the kart. So instead of going from the medium axle with all these adjustments going on, you're moving the kart to a different level, whether it's more stiffer or softer. So we use the axle change when we're starting to feel like the track is evolving a lot and we're running out of adjustments to keep up with it. An axle change is not like a super fun change to make because you need to take a bunch of stuff out, and there's a lot of places where you can leave screws loose, which could result in a really bad day. So yeah, I try not to adjust the axle too much unless, like I said, we have a really big track evolution or something like that where the kart's going to definitely need it. But like I said, most of the time you're going to want to be running the medium axle. That's kind of how karts are built these days. And then the last one here, going to the very back of the kart, is the rear bumper, which is kind of a non-issue. Basically, you know, loose on the rear bumper here, letting it float on its brackets is going to allow the chassis to flex more because you're not physically tying the rear tubes together. If you keep it tight, it's going to really restrict the chassis on how much it can flex, and you'll get less inside rear wheel lift. 99.9% of the time, and when I say 99.9% of the time, I really mean 100% of the time, you're just going to leave it loose. I can think of very few instances where you would want this tight. I cannot recall a single instance in my entire 20 years of racing that I have run the rear bumper tight for any reason. So, I just leave it loose. Just leave it loose. That's almost all the adjustments. We skipped a few things, but I mean, this video, I gotta go to bed here, man. So, yeah, I didn't want to get too overwhelming. I'm sure I did anyway. Some more notes. It can be kind of overwhelming trying to figure out what to change on a go-kart when you have a handling issue. You have, like, we just went over an hour or whatever of adjustments that you can make. like I noted on the axles, most modern karts are getting larger and larger in their tuning windows, because manufacturers want the kart to be very user friendly. So for a long time it was kind of considered that Tony karts or the OTK karts were really user friendly and they had a wide tuning window, that their baseline setup was very good for most conditions, which is what drew a lot of people to that brand. And other manufacturers have caught on to that over the years, and they're starting to build their go-karts so that they also are very easy to tune. Um, so you don't need to be swapping axles in and out every session, stuff like that. So given that information, what you kind of want to do to not get overwhelmed is kind of go off of a baseline setup, kind of the way the kart comes out of the box. The manufacturer is designing karts now so that when they come out of the box, they're pretty good for most conditions. And like I said, you want to make small adjustments. We don't want to over-tune the kart and tune ourselves out of it and flip-flop from one side of the spectrum to the other. So, like I was talking about, those front track widths, little caster and camber changes, torsion bar changes, stuff like that is all really useful. It's all very valid. We play with it all the time, even at a very high level of racing. Those are easy things you can change to notice real difference in the go-kart's handling. For most people who are running like at club races or even regional races, there's not going to be like the rubber build and the track evolution and the competition level, frankly, that requires you to know every adjustment, what it does and when to use it. When you get to bigger races, it's going to be really important to start knowing how to tune the go-kart, how to give feedback to your mechanic if you're not tuning it yourself, and you know, work the kart throughout the day as the track evolves. But on local racing or club racing, not something you need to worry about and knowing all of that stuff. Like I said, track widths, torsion bar, caster, camber, that stuff is pretty easy to understand, and it can be pretty foolproof once you start to really understand how it works and when to use it. Also nowadays a lot of brands are putting out actual chassis guides on how to tune the kart a little bit. So if you can find that for your chassis, if you have a more a larger brand, a more well-known brand that does that, it's good to print that off and have it in your trailer and use that if you can, reference that whenever you can. And know that every brand works a little differently. Like I said in the beginning, some karts don't run a torsion bar in the front, and the kart works great. Some karts need the torsion bar to work. So all this stuff is kind of general, and I might have said something in this video that you go out and test, and you go, "That's completely false, TJ. I don't know what you're talking about." But like I said, not every go-kart tune is the same. That's why it's important to get set up with like a shop or a team or somebody who has actual knowledge tuning your brand of go-kart, so that you can get some advice every now and then. You don't need to be under a big expensive tent program, but if you can call the shop and you can say, "Hey, what would I do if the thing's understeering? What do I do?" They might be able to give you some free advice. And then in the end, the driver is still going to be the biggest factor. Chassis tuning accounts for a small percentage of your overall pace. You can put a very good driver in a not perfect go-kart, and they can get the most out of it, and they're going to be able to go faster than somebody who's not a good driver but in a well set up go-kart. So the chassis is getting the chassis dialed in perfectly is going to find you some tenths, maybe a half a second, but you can easily be far more than that off the pace if your driving is not up to snuff. And along with that, the driver kind of feeds how the chassis handles too, like we talked at the very beginning. If you're driving poorly, if you're hacking the wheel around, the kart's going to feel like garbage, and you're going to think it's the kart, but in reality, it's you. So it's important to make sure that before you start reefing on the go-kart and changing everything, we want to make sure that we're isolating all the variables we can and making sure that the driver is not the issue here. If the driver's driving good and the kart's not that fast, then we can start changing the go-kart. But until then, The driver's got to get up to the level of the cart before you can start changing the level of the cart. Um, but yeah, that's my chassis guide. It was a very long video. My voice gave out halfway through. I had to pause it and get some water. But hopefully, if you stuck around, you understand a little bit more about how to set your go-kart up, how the go-kart physically works, and maybe that will help you go a little bit faster. If you have any questions on anything, leave a comment. I'm happy to reply to comments. I've been getting a lot lately, which is really nice. Yeah, it's very nice to know that people are watching these videos and getting something out of them. So if this was helpful, if you learned anything, absolutely leave a comment. And as usual, like and subscribe. Thank you.